Good morning, councillors. As per the title slide, this is about our Three Waters Reform Workshop, and ultimately by the end of the day, we should be on the path to thinking about what's best for our community in this space. So with that said, the first few slides we're going to go through are about the state of the nation for mpdc and our Three Waters service today. So I appreciate you guys have seen these, but I'll just talk through them and add the notes which you guys didn't have in the slide pack because the notes were for me. Right. So here, what I'm trying to present is our performance against our drinking water standards. So the left-hand box shows you where we are today. So this is the last compliance report we had. As you can see, there's a lot of compliance in there, but there's a couple of faileds and a couple of provisional compliances. So things that we're still discussing with our drinking water assessor. In the right-hand box, you'll see that our overall trend in compliance has been improving. So that's really good. So overall, mpdc is on the right track in terms of our drinking water compliance. It's been improving year on year, but we still fail some areas. And for us, some of those areas, or those areas which we fail, are what I would consider or describe as the quality assurance aspects of the drinking water standards. So for example, you see the column here, protozoa. You don't measure directly for protozoa. You do a whole bunch of things at your treatment plant to guarantee it's not going to be there. So that's where we really struggle. Bacteria we test for directly. So whilst we're improving, eventually we'll get there. One of our next most significant challenges is to move from a quality control approach to drinking water compliance to a quality assurance approach for drinking water compliance. So we're maturing is the point of that slide.
Yep. Thanks, Karl.
The slide here, this is sort of describing what's going on after we do our treatment. As you can see, from time to time, we still have what I've called contamination detectors. This isn't a coli, this is fecal coliforms. And a fecal coliform is a type of bacteria which comes from the gut, like a coli, but maybe not from a mammal. They're also associated, I mean, James would know this as well, they're also associated with breakdown of material. So the point here is that even though we've got good treatment in place, every now and then we do have a problem with treating our water before it gets into the network. So another challenge that we just have to overcome, though we are improving over time. This one here is the same set of results, but this is for our townships. This is once we get into the network. So you can see we're getting numbers here as well. And what we're describing here is if we have numbers in this contamination column, that means that there are bacteria getting into our network after our treatment plant. So what this sort of reflects is how leaky our network is, or how well our backflow prevention is performing. So no E. coli, but we do have some fecal coliforms. Again, the point is we're generally pretty good, but we've got a little bit to focus on here in the future going forward. And finally, to round out our water service, I just collected up from our last survey some of the comments from our community. And the point of this slide was that even though we are doing pretty good and we're trending in the right direction, not all of our customers are overly enamored with our service all of the time. So that's something we need to keep in mind as we move forward, not only as mpdc, but potentially as part of an entity, is that the expectation about what a water service will deliver to a customer is increasing all the time. It's much more than just, can you provide me water at the tap? To support that, here's some of our data from our customer survey reports. As you can see, we're relatively stable. We are sort of in a very slow trend down. And I would say, even though we've invested a lot of money and we have made a lot of improvements, this may reflect this trend may actually reflect customer expectation increasing at a rate faster than we're necessarily responding. So that's that one. So onto the wastewater side of things. So this is our latest compliance report for wastewater. So as you can see, by and large, we are compliant. We have one or two niggly plants like Tahuna there. In my notes here, I see Waiho Wastewater Treatment Plant from last year has got a letter of direction around our performance of that plant. Overall, we are actually doing really, really well in this space. Treatment plant compliance is very tricky. A lot of the Waikato councils really struggle with this, but we are actually doing marvelously well, particularly for our 3 large plants. They do have some challenges, but we're doing pretty good. This here is and we were sort of talking about before, the Scottish water stuff. This is our performance against wastewater overflow standards. So you see, at some point, we may need to focus a bit more on this. We're not actually making our own level of service. And what I'm trying to signal with this slide is that I'd expect to be quite a bit more scrutiny on this sort of data and these sorts of standards going forward, regardless of the reform. Particularly with iwi and mana whenua, there is a drive in the Waikato, and I would say nationwide, to elimination of wastewater overflows. So again, like I said, the point here is that wastewater overflows, we have them, and over time, I think we'll see an increasing focus on the elimination of these. So this will become a focus area in the future for us. Again, customer satisfaction survey. By and large, we are pretty great here. Most people like their service, and I've added just the 1 or 2 comments that we have about that there are 1 or 2 people who aren't happy with the service, but by and large, our wastewater service is doing very, very well. We do have a couple of niggly areas for those who have been involved. Number 2 Pools Road and 10 Mountain View Road and Te Araha have been 2 particular customers which I could recall having wastewater issues. So onto this slide. So again, this is about framing up the resilience challenges we have in our district. So this slide here is obviously our recent drought. And the question here really is, how resilient are our assets against natural events such as drought or flooding? So we know that we're doing a lot of work, particularly in Morrinsville, around diversification of water supplies by getting bores in place and not relying exclusively on the dam there. But there are also other types of events, unnatural events, that we need to consider resilience on and start planning for that potential in the future. For example, some topical ones, cyber attack. So as we all know, the Waikato DHB was hit with a ransomware attack, and so was St. Peter's, Cambridge. But I'm not so sure too many of you know that actually the St. Peter's attack actually knocked out our printing as well. We weren't actually affected by the virus, but we had the same exploit. The point here being, overall our assets, council-wide, but in particular water, do have an exposure to these sorts of risks. Terrorism as well. It's widely appreciated the most likely point of terrorism is an ex-employee, disgruntled employee who has access to the treatment plants. Our treatment plants are even more accessible than that. A lot of them don't even have fencing. So, resilience questions that we may need to focus on in the future, and I expect standards and the regulators will sort of push us in these sorts of directions as well over time, regardless of whether we participate in the reform. As another example of our resilience challenges, this here is a photo of the 2017 flooding that we had here in Te Araha. The left-hand image there, the graph, that shows what's the predicted rainfall over periods of time into the future. So the point is that if you take the lighter coloured lines and compare them to the darker coloured lines above them, that we're looking at between 5 and 10% more rain in a large-scale rain event than we are experiencing today. So the question is, are our assets able to cope with that? Are our assets in the right place to be dealing with that? Are our stormwater assets large enough to take that stormwater? In terms of our wastewater, if this flooding is 10% worse, how much of our wastewater network is going to be underground, and how much of that stormwater will be in our wastewater network? Again, just reliability and resilience questions. We've got a lot of those to deal with as we move forward, just like any other council. This slide here is another resilience slide, even though it says renewals, but this is our performance delivering renewals since 2012, 2013. So as you can see here, the problem is not with our funding. Our funding's great. I appreciate it. This council funds our depreciation fully, which is amazing. It's not a problem with our planning, because as you can see here, the bars in the bar graph are the actual planned profiles from Susan's team, and they're adequate. They're based on actual data, lives, and things like that, and being refined all the time as we get further data. But the problem here is delivery. It's my team. It's our ability to actually keep up with these bars. And as you can see, over time, I've added in a accumulated underspend. So the point in this slide is that even though we plan and we fund our renewals well, we don't necessarily deliver all our renewals all the time. That's a challenge for us. And what's that doing is it's actually causing our assets to age. So as a total, they're aging, they're getting reliability issues, they're getting water leaks. 26% of our water actually leaks out of our networks. That we have I&I issues. The point is that going forward, this will, again, like all the other issues that I've raised, this will become a focus area for us as well. It's all good funding and planning, but we'll need to change the way we deliver to keep up with our renewals load going forward to make sure this peak doesn't occur, or at least to minimize it and eventually get on top of it. We're already doing some of those things. So for example, we've moved from yearly renewals contracts to 3-yearly renewals contracts in order to sort of provide the market with a greater level of assurance and hope that they will scale up for us. We've recently done a minor restructure of that team and really focused on how they actually deliver projects. But if you overlay this historical, at least, inability to deliver our renewals with what at least the government says needs to happen, which is we need to double our renewals, our investment again, this is quite a significant challenge for us, which hits us in multiple ways with our assets.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit in here about currently our challenges being flexible around delivery some of our growth projects. I know at the time of the long-term plan, we made the best assumptions at the time with the data we have to plan for our growth projects. And we do have quite a lot of growth projects in our long-term plan, as you're aware of, and have quite funding through the development contributions to fund those. But it's just as growth decides to be quicker than what we anticipated, it can be a bit of a challenge to try and deliver some of those projects earlier on too. And there is a little bit of a risk involved I suppose, when moving some of those things earlier, that if the growth then doesn't happen, and that leaves council a little bit liable. But we have tried to plan accordingly to make sure that our pipes are not going to be too big. So they are kind of servicing for the zoned land that we've got in the district plan. So there are just some challenges around, and then future planning as well. We've got a number of plan changes that are currently kind of on the go, or people have approached council about, and just then we're kind of on the back foot. So trying to plan ahead for even further infrastructure does put kind of the pressure on our resourcing and then funding as well. Yeah.
As Susan and I both said, we've got challenges in multiple areas here, but mpdc's been, over time, mpdc's been rising to those challenges. I mean, you remember, especially councillors have been around for a bit longer, remember the significant upgrades that were done at Te Araha Wastewater Treatment Plant and Morrinsville Wastewater Treatment Plant to respond to the changing landscape as it was then. And you'll all certainly remember compliance recovery program and the amount of money we're spending catching up on things that need to be done at our water treatment plants. So the point of the slides is that we have challenges, and that we do rise to them over time. But as we move forward into the world, there will need to be an increasing amount of focus on these sorts of things to keep up with the expectations of not just the government, but also the regulators which exist now. And that will be for us, Waikato Regional Council, Te Mata-Piako, the new water service regulator, and also our customers and what they expect from us as well. So this slide here is, again, adding to that, is we're in a world of regulatory and legislative change at the moment. So the first and most, one of the more significant ones is the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, which as you can see here, is really changing the landscape on how we manage our water assets. Prioritizing the health and well-being of water bodies. There's new language and new concepts in this space, improving degraded water bodies. It's not just now about holding the line and not letting it get any worse. It's now about improving. And also, where you can't improve, we must stop further degradation and then eventually move to restoration. So the bar has been lifted in terms of our environmental performance through the freshwater management national policy statement, which isn't even live yet. So this is still being worked on. It's in our future. So as a practical example of how this may shift the bar for mpdc, the slides here, the top slides are, well, top images are of what we're considering for the Matamata wastewater treatment plant. For those who don't know, our consent for this treatment plant expires in 2023, and we're going through a reconsenting process. So step one of that was to look at, well, what do we think might be reasonable in terms of upgrades, expectation of upgrades for us moving into the future. The left-hand model, there, figure 10, shows where we thought we were going to be before the national policy statement. The cost for that solution, the left-hand solution, figure 10, is $5.5 million of CapEx. As the national policy statement developed and became more visible, we actually had to investigate figure 7 there, which is the cost of that, $9.1 million. So that's what we've planned on our long-term plan. We have $11 million baked away in the LTP. But the point I wanted to bring across is, if the national policy statement, if the impacts of national policy statement to lift the bar any higher than what we think it's going to, we don't know, but we think it's going to lift it to the figure 7 solution and $9.1 million, it may actually push us all the way up to a complete land discharge model, which would be $27.4 million of what we've estimated cost-wise. So you can sort of see the ramping up there. Before NPS, 5.5. Where we think NPS is going to land, 9.1. Where it could land, $27.4 million. So that's just one plant. So there's a lot of upward pressure there in terms of environmental performance being driven by the national policy statement. Another area that you may not think about regularly in this space in terms of the national policy statement is stormwater activity. So we actually haven't done a heck of a lot of work. We've done what we can with the information we have at the time, but we haven't actually tried to understand what the national policy statement will do to our stormwater activity. So it's completely uncosted at the moment. We have about $100,000 year on year in the LTP for level of service improvements. But we've yet to sort of figure out, hey, what are the actual nuts and bolt implications of this legislative tool on this service. Our consent's up for renewal in 2024, so that time for consideration is really happening now, and that's what my team, along with Susan's team, are actively looking at. So next one here is our drinking water standards. So as we all know, we now have Matamata-Piako. They've got powers with their own legislation there as a regulator, and they've done some things already, and they've signaled some things already. And that's, again, going to drive the pace of change in the drinking water space much quicker than we have seen historically. One, they've removed the requirement to only be able to change drinking water standards once every 5 years. In fact, Matamata-Piako can change the drinking water standards as and when they need. They do need to consult, but if they deem an issue to be urgent and they can convince the minister, they don't actually need to consult on it at all. So in theory, I don't think it's going to be in practice, but in theory, we could have new requirements popping up overnight should a significant risk be identified that requires urgent change. At the moment, well, not at the moment, historically, any changes required a 5-year period to allow councils to gear up to meet that new standard. So I don't think we'll get a lot of things happening overnight, but what I do think is that 5-yearly cycle will be much more truncated as Matamata-Piako tries to keep up with international trends that they identify internationally, obviously. Some things have also signaled is changes to what we call contact time. So the way that we treat our water with chlorine will need to change. They've already signaled that. Sodium hypochlorite, bleach. We add some bleach to our water to remove bacteria. They're adding in age limits and batch information to that. That's something we don't collect or don't manage at the moment, and will fundamentally change how we supply treatment plants and how we use that chemical. As we've seen, measuring of total coliforms, we never had to do that before. Now we are. that may lead to some sort of compliance standards. There isn't any at the moment, but that may lead to a compliance standard. Backflow prevention, we don't do that particularly well.
Oh,
and there'll be a focus on managed correctly in the future. My video's cut out. Am I back now?
Yep.
But there's some give and take here, guys. So I've put the last two down there. Some things will actually get easier for us as well. Matamata-Piako has already signaled that there'll be some leniency for missing minutes and some reduction in turbidity standards. So we do get a little bit back from them.
No, that's good.
But overall, I would see the pace of change in this area increasing with higher standards in areas that we didn't actually necessarily consider standards before. Oh, oops, I skipped one. So this slide here is about the water services bill. So this is currently, I think it's just moved out of the select committee process and it's in its second reading, I think. But this is the bill which will define how a water supplier, it defines the bar a water supplier needs to make in terms of being a water supplier and the service it provides. So the interesting ones here for us is that all our suppliers will now be considered large suppliers. They've reduced the limit. So the limit used to be 5,000. You'd be considered a large supply. So obviously we had places like, maybe not today, but historically, Matamata and Tiaraha have sort of been on or just under that limit, which meant the standards could be a bit lower for us. But as of, as soon as this bill hits law, we will require to be at the top level standard across all our suppliers. Matamata-Piako will also have the ability to define compliance rules, which we haven't had before. So they'll be able to tell us how to treat our drinking water, what treatments they can prohibit, and we must respond to those compliance rules, which is something we haven't had before. Matamata-Piako will also be able to issue compliance orders and tell us to stop doing or require us to start doing things which we weren't doing before. So our regulator, the point is our regulator is going to get much more involved with how we run this service and be much more dictatorial or directional about how water services shall be run in New Zealand, but obviously that includes us as well. This slide here is a continuation of that. So so the point of this slide was that along with those abilities to reach into our water business and tell us what to do, Matamata-Piako also has the ability to fine council. So for example here, the top example there being recklessness in the supply of unsafe drinking water. So if we were to do something in the future to supply unsafe drinking water, we could be up for a $3 million fine. So much more hefty penalties than what we're currently operate under. And there's another interesting one in there. These aren't the only offences. There are a whole bunch, but these are just two that I thought you might find interesting. Also, the failure to supply sufficient quantity of water, a fine of $200,000. So the bar is lifting.
Okay, Karl, can I just comment on that, please?
Yeah, go on.
So looking at that thing and that Don sent out as well from the DIA around that, and I'll just read out the thing. The new regulator, Matamata-Piako, will enforce existing standards for significant proposed penalties, including fines and criminal proceedings. The Water Services Bill is going through Parliament right now. The Water Services Bill, once enacted, will impose new offences, some carrying criminal penalties for council officers, employees and agents of drinking water suppliers. It will also confer new duties on local authorities to ensure communities have access to safe drinking water if existing private and community suppliers face problems in complying with the regulatory requirements. Is that not threatening? It'd be interesting to see if legal.
Yes, it is threatening.
Yeah, and that's what I believe too. I'd like to get a lawyer's take on that, because especially when they're talking about making our workers personally responsible for that, and I don't think it's right, and not happy. I don't respond well to threats.
I think
I don't
member
think you should be in jail, Carl. I don't think it's a good thing for you to be.
It's definitely a lifting of the bar, and there have been some tough words to the industry as well. I think the point is not to take away that we're going to throw people in jail. I don't think that's the way Matamata-Piako wants to work. We need to be conscious of the fact that provisions and the ability is there, but I think it's overall a signal that, hey, there are repercussions for not delivering as per the standard in the future. Repercussions that we haven't really experienced.
Would that not be put more pressure on these 4 water boards? Who the hell would want to be on them? You know, with a lot of councils that may not be compliant. Surely no sane person would want to be on those boards with that level of scrutiny and fining that could happen.
I guess the point is, this is independent of this is going to happen independent of the wider reform. This is happening now. This is legislation at its second reading, and regardless of whether they do an amalgamation or not, this is the sandpit we're now playing in terms of how we need to meet the standards of the drinking water standards and the wider services bill.
I guess Don could take the rap because he's had some good years anyway.
It's cruel.
I'd make the point too, just to put some context on this. I think this is, just remember, this is for more significant supplies, not necessarily for the farmer supplying 2 or 3 houses from the same bore. I think they're taking a more pragmatic approach on that one and looking at prescribing ways of achieving the standard, e.g. inline filters and UV treatment and that sort of thing. So I don't think this will reach down necessarily to low levels. But the point about a regulatory system is that as a monopoly, and I know you'll understand this, but as a monopoly, you need attention to make you perform because you are not subject to the competitive pressure. And it is just human nature that if you don't have, if you like, consequences, you take the foot off the pedal. And there's nothing like fines or names and shaming to focus the mind on achieving outcomes.
Agreed.
So, so the final bit I wanted to talk about, at least in terms of the change in regulatory framework, was this amendment to the Local Government Act, which is part of the Water Services Bill. And essentially here, what this says is that there's a duty to ensure communities have access to drinking water, which is in and of itself is fine. But later in the amendment, what it actually does is, this is what I describe the known unknown risk that we have as a water service provider going forward. This amendment will allow Matamata-Piako to require a water service provider to take over another water service provider's business. So this is designed for places, at least in our context, places like Waiho with their little private supply, or even Fonterra down the road from there with their private supply. This is designed for them to walk away from those responsibilities if they cannot meet the drinking water standards, and council, or the entity, if we chose to be part of that, would become the supplier of last resort, and we would need to take those over. So that is, like I said, is the known unknown here. I know that Matamata-Piako, when they were established, they thought there might have been about 7,000 of these sorts of private schemes in the nation. They're an order of magnitude out. It's closer to 80,000, and I'm sure that number is climbing every day. For us, that's about 1,500 in our area. It can even go all the way down to, and I'm sure some of you guys living rurally may even be in this situation. If you're a rural property and you might have a bore, and your bore supplies 2 houses, you are also a supplier. So the point of this slide is that we have going forward, we as council, or us as part of an entity, if we choose, have a liability sitting out there we don't entirely understand, and a requirement as per this act to deliver water services to these customers, even though we may not have had any relationship with them or their infrastructure in the past.
Oh, does that mean the farmers in the room situation?
Yeah, well, at least as
Yes,
it's currently drafted. Though, in saying that,
Yeah, I was
so,
going to ask that, Carl. Yeah. Sorry.
no, okay, I'll explain that. So very broadly, yes, it does. But there are other mechanisms, without getting too much into the details of the legislation. There are these mechanisms called acceptable solutions, and they're targeted at smaller suppliers. So your farm type suppliers, they may say the top line is, yes, you must comply with the drinking water standards, but the byline says, but in your circumstances, being a small supplier and a rural supplier, you can implement this off-the-shelf solution, and that will tick all the boxes for you. So there's only one of those drafted at the moment. That's called the Rural Agricultural Water Supply Acceptable Solution. So a whole bunch of those will be developed over time. So for us as council, what does this mean? If you think of a future state, potentially a future state will be a council. We'll have our own suppliers we've always had, plus we'll have a bunch of other suppliers. Some of those suppliers might be quite small and might comply against a myriad of these acceptable solutions. Having a team technically skilled enough to manage that and apply the right solution to the right problems, treatment supply problems, will be quite a barrier for us in terms of skill and acquiring that sort of skill. People like Nerida and her team will become much more important to the running of our business than they are today, and they are quite important today. So that sort of brings to the end, me to the end of our sort of state of play and where the future is moving in terms of the frameworks and legislation that we have to work within. And this here is the beginning of the slides sort of framing up the government's point of view. This is the government's case for change. The point of these slides is not to argue you around or show you the merits. I'm just stating these out so we're all on the same page, have the same baseline about why the government says or thinks the way they're thinking. We can disagree with it, but this is how they've approached this problem. So the case for change. Nationwide, we have $54.6 billion worth of water assets, about 5,000 staff, and 4.3 million customers. The government sees the water sector as one of New Zealand's most significant, and it needs to be a thriving system in order for New Zealand to be successful. That's what they see at an absolute top level. So when they investigated, at least the investigations they undertook, this is what caused them concern. They see that there's poor compliance with drinking water standards nationally. This is from one of their reports. And as you can see, there's not too many green bubbles in here. So there are definitely the majority of New Zealand, to certain degrees, are not receiving what they would call demonstratively compliant, demonstratively safe drinking water. So that's a red flag to the government, at least that's their approach.
Who did that, Carl? Who did that?
So this is actually from a Becker report, which the government commissioned, and what it's actually done is it's just taken the Ministry of Health's annual water report, and all they've done is they've coloured a map based on that water report. So the underlying data is our compliance data that every council needs to submit to their drinking water assessor.
So are we the red? We're not red there, are we?
This is us. Yep. We're red here.
But Wellington's green.
Yep. Oh, just by the way, just a little plug for myself. That's the Waikato district there as well. That's green. They're welcome. But you can see why. It's a shameless plug. So if you went back up to the top slides, you'd see why we're red. It doesn't take into account that it's a technical non-compliance or anything like that. It just looks at, did you comply with the standards or not?
Yeah, so it's quite one-dimensional then, isn't it?
Percentages, Carl. So like, in the slides you can't read. So what's the difference between the green and red?
Yeah, sorry, the image is actually really poor. So obviously green is 0% non-compliance. Red is between 99 and 100% non-compliance.
Oh, I got it around the wrong way. Okay.
Yeah, so red is not anybody is getting compliant water. And for us, back in 2019, 2018, the reason for that would be exclusively that we didn't make our protozoa compliance. That would be it. And that's quite a technical condition. And as you saw from the slides above, and we explained, it's a quality assurance approach that we can't quite make yet.
What about now, though?
What about now? We're definitely improving. Taraha last year was compliant with all aspects of the drinking water standards for the first time. That's good. And we're moving definitely in that direction with other plants. We're doing our compliance upgrades and also our SCADA upgrades to capture the data that we need. So that's our technical non-compliance grumble, is that we typically don't have the right data or enough data to prove that we are compliant with drinking water standards. That is the big challenge for us.
So it's more a technical non-compliance more than an actual physical non-compliance then.
Yep, it's a technical non-compliance, but I guess we're at risk of making it sound bigger than what it really is. The point is that some things can hurt us in water, like protozoa, and the only way to know you don't have them in the water, because you can't test for them routinely, is to guarantee they're not going to be there. And for us, even though people aren't getting sick, we can't guarantee that we've always removed that protozoa. So it's very technical in nature, but underlying that technical nature is a public health requirement.
And is it possible to actually do that?
Yeah, absolutely is. That's that's what we did in my practical experience in the Waikato. Doing a lot of the things that we're doing today, keeping up with our renewals, adding a new data system on top of what we already have, and you'll be amazed at both, one, how well you're actually performing, and two, the tiny little grumbles that you have in your treatment plants you never knew existed because you never had the data for it. But I'm sort of laboring the point there, so we'll just, if it's okay with you guys, I'll just move on to the next slide.
Yep.
So this one here, again, from the government's point of view, nationally, we have 35,000 cases of acute gastroenteritis from reticulated drinking water every year. And as we all remember, Havelock North was quite a significant one, resulting in 4 deaths. But this is happening every year, and this is what the government's responding to in their eyes. Oops, wrong roller. There we go. They're also seeing, this is a graph from the Auditor General's report into the 3 waters from 2017, I think this report was. And this is the renewals figures over time. So I've marked mpdc on that, because as you can see, out of all councils, there's a whole bunch of them who aren't delivering all the renewals they need to. And we also have that problem. So they're seeing that as well, that eventually our assets are actually getting older and their levels of service are regressing because we're not keeping up with the renewals. So this here is from the Scottish Water, the WICS, sorry, this is from the WICS modelling, and their rough estimate that we're actually about only funding 50% of what we need to be funding, or 63% of what we need to be funding. Whether you believe that or not, this is immaterial. This is what the government's responding to.
What's your opinion, Karl?
I actually think mpdc is pretty good. I think, like I said, at the top slides there in our State of the Nation, I think we're pretty good. We've got a good council over time, not just you guys, but historically, but a good council who recognises the need to spend on assets. We've got a good asset team who are always refining and developing their understanding of our assets and are proactive in responding when new information comes up. So I think we've got the funding right, we've got the planning right. Just at times our delivery lets us down, and we're trying to address that too.
So if our delivery had been 100%, or say 95%, like across New Zealand the last 5 years, when we didn't have a labour shortage and a supply chain, how do you think that would have stacked up compared to what WICS have told us?
I think that's a charged question. That one.
I think what percentage?
I think if we were at 100%, I think that the difference would be what we would know in ourselves as a council, and through our own reporting and through our own metrics, we would know we're performing quite a bit better than the pack, and the WIC stuff would just seem much more alien to us. I don't think they're meant to be directly comparable in that sense. What the government's done with WICs is they've asked them and said, hey, from your experience in Scotland, where do you think we are? And that's what they've said. They've said, oh, the average New Zealander is, well, the average rural New Zealander is spending $158. When we scale it for what people were spending, rural people spending in Scotland, we had to increase that by doubling it. And that's what they've roughly done here, and said, well, if you're spending 158 today, based on what we found out when we did our stuff in Scotland, it actually needed to be 253. So I don't think they're directly comparable like that. Sorry, Neil.
Yep.
So it's probably not very satisfying.
No, what I was getting at was, like, when you told us in our renewals that we had only done a certain percentage of it, like, so what if we'd done the whole lot? Where would we be as a cost, like, for that? And what would that have done to our figures here?
Oh,
our projects, yeah.
Then what would have happened is that, what would have happened? I guess our number would be slightly closer to that 253.
Yeah.
But it would just be more of a baseline number. So as you would have seen in the previous slide, our number is sort of climbing. That blue flat line is sort of climbing. It would be stabilized and flat continuously across that whole graph, but probably slightly higher, somewhere in between the lower and the upper value, which would have been somewhere slightly north of that 158, I guess, without having done the maths.
Cool. So just to the side then, do you know, like, sort of, for say, like water care, what percentage have they been doing of their renewals? Do they get completed? Like, so.
I do not know that, but we could put that down as something we could try to investigate for a follow-up workshop, if you like.
Because for me, that's the crux of it, is because if we can only complete 65 to 70% anyway of our renewals, and they're working on the entity getting 100% complete, or 85 to 90% perhaps. So what is Auckland City Council or Watercare completing at the moment, being stood up there at the same size, Because I don't think it's the size of the entity that's having the problem. It's the size of New Zealand that's having the problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think overall, your approach there, Neil, of comparing where you think the entity may be, what the entity may do, comparing it to what Watercare is doing today, is probably in my opinion, is probably a fairly safe way of doing it, because Watercare already has a lot of the economies of scale and the structures you'd see coming through in these new entities.
Yeah.
But I'll try to find that information for you for our next workshop, if you like.
Yep.
Yeah. So this slide here is the environmental outcomes slide. So what you're seeing here is wastewater overflows caused by blockages, plant failures, and totals year on year. So the point here is that the government sees the bars are going up from year to year, that we're having more overflows, and that impacts the environment negatively. So we're having an increasing negative impact on the environment by the existence and performance of our wastewater and stormwater networks.
So my question here then is, Karl, is do you think we're having more, or do you think we're having more recorded?
Yeah, recorded.
Yeah.
Because this is like the work safe and health and safety now, where we're sitting here an hour ago and Kate's telling us about everything that's being recorded now that never used to be recorded.
Yeah. My money is on that the majority of the increase, not entirely, but the majority of the increase is increased reporting and transparency. Again, if you were to put on your government hat and root for them, they would say, well, that's what we're after. I think naturally we're doing that ourselves. We are much more transparent over time as we understand the need to be transparent and the impacts of these things. Council really gets on that bandwagon and moves that forward. But I think there is also a portion of that which would be related to the renewals and funding, the delivery deficit side, where if you're not keeping up with your renewals, then over time, slowly your network's getting worse. In this case, you're getting more infiltration and ingress of stormwater or whatever, more damaged pipes, which get snags and blockages, and those result to more wastewater overflows. But I think right now, today, the majority of that increase is probably because people are importing it more.
Yeah, and good to see that the plant failure is decreasing.
Yeah, yep. So again, once you know what the problem is and you can sort it out, usually councils get onto it.
Yeah.
There are some areas, there's some larger scale issues, as you can see though. Like networks, you can't replace your whole network like you can with a pump. So plant failure includes things like pumps, but you can't obviously replace your whole entire piped network overnight if you had a problem like you can a pump.
It's a bit difficult to quantify that slide, Karl. You'd have to think that Wellington and Auckland make up the fair whack of those transgressions, I would imagine. So it's a little difficult to kind of put that, but I mean, would that be the case? Because I mean, you'd almost want to do that on a council by council basis to be able to have a look at that properly. But we are very aware that Auckland and Wellington are probably the two worst areas in the country.
Yep. For those who really want to look at that sort of stuff, you can go onto the Water NZ website and look at their national survey. So every year they run a survey where councils participate across the three waters and report these sorts of numbers. And you can actually see who's doing what. Again, the standard 2 report is not defined what people consider an overflow or not, or what's a wet weather overflow and what's not. And it's a honesty box system, but there is information out there trying to quantify that at a council to council level.
I think one of the areas that may become a bit of an issue for us is at the moment, for example, we have a stormwater consent to discharge stormwater through our sewer system, because that acknowledges the reality of infiltration, be it from various places, be it through pipes that aren't, where the joints are broken or cracked, where the cracked pipes, whether they're gully traps in houses that get surface water flowing into them in times of heavy rain. The reality is that what you might term a stormwater overflow sometimes gets suppressed by the fact that currently that situation is consented. Now, for us, for example, that consent comes up in 23. Now, what regional council may say, given the new MPS around fresh water, is to say, well, at the moment, we only require you to make best endeavours to reduce this infiltration. In the future, we might start putting performance measures around that in terms of the amount of ingress we would want you to reduce by, or the amount of pipe we want you to renew in order to stop the stormwater using the sewer system as its means of getting into the river.
But yeah, and on top of that, just keep in mind, guys, this is what the government's thinking, and they're seeing obviously everything at a national level. They're not diving into the individual councils there either.
Yeah, thanks, Karl.
So this slide here, another element that the government's looking at is resilience, driven by climate change primarily. More areas of the country, particularly rural areas, are experiencing trouble with flooding and droughts. Water shortages, and these disproportionately affect people in our sort of communities. They're seeing this as an issue that needs to have a collaborative solution to. One particular tidbit they picked out was water supply being lost, so leakage being at about 21%, thinking that's unacceptable, and that this needs to improve. For us in MPDC, as we sort of talked about, ours is 26.8 at the moment. So they're seeing this as a challenge across New Zealand.
A lot.
Another one that we don't think about directly, or actually we think we perform relatively well against, actually, without thinking about it though, is outcomes for iwi Māori. So iwi and Māori are more likely to receive poorer Three Waters services than other communities. as you guys know, I'm still relatively new here, but from what I have seen, I think we have in the past and continuing going forward been quite proactive with connecting up Papakāinga and other sites or other areas that iwi want connected. We're going through our planning process at the moment, talking to Rukumoana. They've already got a wastewater service, but extending the water service out there as well. Actually, they've got a water service too. So I think we're doing relatively well here, but at a New Zealand Inc. level, the government sees this as a significant issue that iwi Māori are behind the pack again in terms of water services. This slide here is the affordability challenge. So we've all seen the slides, we've all seen the dashboards and bits and pieces, but the government, they said, well, from their point of view, if you were to fix all the above problems, how much would it cost? And they reckon it's going to cost, that $120 to $180 billion over 30 years. And when they extrapolate that out to the cost per household, you can see there's some rather high water bills at the end of it for individual areas. And we all know that's one of the drivers there for the aggregation is like, well, how do you suppress or manage those price increases? If you can spread it, it's better as the government's point of view. Well, why is this happening? Why is the state, as New Zealand Inc., why is the state of the three waters industry the way it is? And the government came to the conclusion that it's the design. The design's the root cause here. Most local authorities serve about 100,000 or fewer ratepayers connected to their systems, and that's inefficient scale-wise. It's just not where we need to be. It doesn't drive strategic or coordinated asset planning. It limits opportunities. It means we are only a receiver of services and products in the supply chain, not a leader, and all those other things there in the list you guys have all read before. So when they compared that to international best practice, and as you see from the slides before, they say about 600, 800,000 is where you get those economies of scale. So that's part of the government's thinking here. And you can take all those things that we weren't doing at our $100,000 council scale and flip them on their head and say, being 600 to 800,000 customers in size improves your access to capital markets. It makes you more attractive to independent professional governance and management, improves your stability financially. It improves your sector capacity because you've got the ability to create a pipeline for talent. And it also allows you to manage the regulatory burden a bit better as well. Is the government's point of view and thinking on it. The other question that sort of pops up from time to time is, well, how would we go if you just gave us some bloody good regulators and let us go the way we needed to? So the government again sort of thinks that regulation can only go so far. And by and large, the argument in behind this is that under the status quo, if you had 67 councils, that is quite a job for Te Mata Arawai or an economic regulator to manage the regulation across those 67. So that fundamentally changes the type of regulator and the type of regulation regime you can practically implement. And those types of regulation regimes that have to deal with larger numbers of players are typically light touch and wouldn't drive the efficiencies or the lifts and standards that are required. And you can, at least from a government point of view, you can sort of inherently see a lot of that thinking across a lot of their projects at the moment around aggregation. So that's another drive for them. They're saying, yep, you can have new regulators. We reckon they're going to do a really good job, but they can only do a really good job if they're focused on a small number of larger entities, is what they're actually saying.
Hey, Karl, just on that though, like, surely though with a regulator in place, you could pick up the things like they could then put the pressure on, say you likes of Wellington City that are in the news, but when you look at their debt to revenue, they're obviously underspending. They've got a higher revenue than they have and what they're actually getting, spending by, I think they're only like 68% of their debt to revenue cap. Well, obviously this is why their pipes are breaking yet too, So the regulator then could, in theory, make chlorination of the water mandatory. So then you potentially wouldn't get your Havelock North scenarios, you know. So I think there's plenty of things that a new regulator would be able to make it in terms of improvements. And also they could also identify councils that haven't been rating properly, you know, for the waters, like your Tarongas and your Hamilton cities, for example, you know. So
yeah,
I think there's some real easy wins for a regulator, to be fair.
Yep, and that's fine. I think that's a good positive discussion to have with the government around this. This is just their point of view, is that if we really want to make a bang for our buck with new regulators, we need them to focus on 4 entities, not 67. But you could be right there, Ash. There might be some actual really low-hanging fruit that the regulators across 67 councils, if it stayed as status quo, could pick at and get us, I don't know, 60, 70, 80% of the way there to improvement. I don't know that for sure, but you know, that's I guess the end of the day here for our discussion is that an area as council that we want to talk with the government about and say, hey, you know, have you really tested this out? This is what we think.
Yeah, thanks.
I've got a question. I've got a question too, Karl. Just with the, you know, when they talk about this economies of scale for 600 to 800,000 population, I sort of liken it to perhaps dairy companies and factories. You know, once upon a time they were everywhere where you could have a cart your cream to, but doesn't there come a point where is the economy of scale when you compare a large city with a rural area that's dispersed? You know, you've got to have several treatment plants, because obviously efficiency is having one plant. So you've got, yeah, I just, is there anything, any data behind that to, I'm just sort of challenged by that talk of economy of scale when you're comparing an apple with a pear.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think you've heard that through the media as well. I think maybe Christopher Luxon back at the LGNZ conference is one of the first people that I at least heard in the media sort of talking about this, was that, hey, a question which could be good for council or the region to take back is these economies of scale, how realistic are they, is a question mark. They could be 100% realistic, but you can at least test that, because when you talk about aggregation and you talk about economies of scale, at least for me, I sort of go to something like the electricity industry. Obviously, Adrian, you go to the dairy industry, but you're right, the centralization of key assets, which isn't entirely, at least as an international level, isn't entirely reasonable for water and wastewater assets. So how much is that? How significant is that? How much of that's being factored in to the savings gains or the efficiency gains or whatever that the government has planned or signaled?
Yeah.
You know, I don't think it's, I think maybe that's, again, it's another area that you want to target and just sort of say, well, show us the sensitivity on this or that or the other thing. I mean, there's probably some very cunning questions to ask, which I wouldn't know, but potentially it's an area of investigation for us.
So that's my kind of thought, Karl, too, that we should be pushing it as the Waikato region, because that's our only way that we can get something. I think that's our economy of scale, because that's who we deal with anyway as our regulator. And I've got no interest at all in Whakatane or Taranaki, because they're a totally different catchment, a totally different regional council, you know, and I can't see that we're going to be making any gains in that. I don't have any problems or issues with us pairing up with Hamilton and Waipa and Waikato and running our own like we do for everything else already. And I think that's where the part that really irks me is that in the reports that they did for the financial lending and the borrowings and that, they've redacted all the information showing that basically there's no difference in the economies of scale for the size and what people can borrow. But even if we do it for our region, we'll actually get a reasonably good rating anyway. So that's where we need to be pushing, because they've hidden away the information from us, saying that basically they need this many people for the financial, but they don't. They actually only, because we're still very viable in a smaller scale as councils anyway, and a water services for the Standard & Poor's rating.
Yeah, and again, something I think I've got down further in our issues slides as well as a key thing to sort of talk about, you know, is for the right number. I'm not sure we're going to have a lot of, I don't actually know at all, we will have a lot of traction talking to government about that. But, maybe that's a cornerstone of a discussion regionally about that, is what's the right size? How many economies of scale are you willing to trade for local influence and community fit? I don't know. They're just question marks I'm putting out there for you. I don't envy you guys. You guys have to have these discussions and actually come to conclusions of it around them. But yeah, you're right there, Neil. You could put together an argument and test that with government as well.
Because I've got no interest at all in the full well-beings for Wanganui or Wakatani.
Yeah.
But I do have for Cambridge and Huntly, because our people travel there and work there and stuff and everything, and that's the social and the cultural. And I've got no idea even who the iwi tribes are down those areas. So I just can't see how, and I know that the iwi aren't particularly interested in sharing with those guys. Right, they have to fight and send out 5 or 6 representatives from the district. We're not going to get a say.
No.
By the time we take Hamilton, New Plymouth and Tauranga, for starters, they're going to be on the board.
Yeah, well, that's definitely an issue we've got in the slides later on to have a good discussion about, is how do you ensure MPDC's voice is heard if you are going to be part of a larger entity.
And that's the thing, they contradict themselves too, Karl, in a lot of respects. They say that the ideal amount is between 600 and 800,000 connections for economies of scale. And yet, if you look at the entity A, there's 1.7 million connections.
Yeah.
And they think that's a good model. So it's like,
Yeah, so I think probably the interesting thing for me out of the discussion, out of just this recent thing, is that both the mayor and the deputy mayor agree in principle that there's some delivery around the economies of scale. So probably we seem to agree on that. Let's think about the details downstream.
So I might just sort of skip these next 2 slides a little bit. They're just additional information around the government's thinking about the scale these entities need to be. But at the bottom line of them is that those larger groupings of customers and larger entities is where the government sees things needing to go.
The Becker report was very interesting and easy to read. The Farawaya report seemed to take a, Bob each way, really.
I think it was covering its behind, Sue, to be honest.
Yes.
The thing I got out of the who knows how to pronounce that word? Do you know how to pronounce it, Karl?
Farrier.
They're actually 2 different people.
Yeah.
It's Mr. Farrier and Mr. Swire.
Yeah,
we are.
That's their company. Yeah.
That's their company.
The thing I took out of his thing was any modelling, any proposition is based on making assumptions. And assumptions have error. Inherently, they're wrong. It's how wrong they are. And the thing I took out of the peer review was, look, we're not saying everything the government put forward in terms of the proposition can be certain. It is uncertain. It may even be wrong. But overall, the direction of travel seems credible. And that's the only thing I took out of that, because everything else was, as I say, covering butt.
Absolutely. 104 pages of it.
Okay.
The first comment I'd like to make is that our report was an independent assessment. And so we tried to be fully transparent about how we went about the analysis and all of the issues that we considered. And we identified, as if you've read our report, all the limitations in that analysis. So we feel that we very carefully scrutinised the WICS analysis, and in that process we had quite a lot of robust discussions with WICS. So I guess we'd like to just assure you that we approach this very, very seriously, and so some of the findings and the language in our report are definitely balanced, but they definitely tested what Wix had to say. The second thing I'd like to say, and it's relevant to the Castalia report, is that Wix was analysing a total package of reforms, right? So it wasn't just about amalgamation, it was about amalgamation, reforms in governance, and the introduction of economic regulation. And I think it's important to understand that those all kind of work together and are quite interlinked. And so we can perhaps talk about that more later. The next point I think I'd like to talk about is uncertainty. So as anybody who's been involved in any kind of planning for the future, especially over a 30-year time frames, knows that we're fundamentally dealing with uncertainty. That's a critical challenge that we all have. And so naturally in our report, we called out quite a large number of limitations in the analysis. Now, I suspect that many of those limitations one would call out in any report undertaken by any expert undertaking this kind of modelling over a 30-year period. So, I think you as decision makers need to be conscious that at the end of the day, we need to make judgments about this analysis and whether we feel it's reasonable. It's just not possible to accurately predict the world, over a 30-year period.
So that was the most important one, is Jeff's comments there. But we can do Gary if you guys want to do Gary as well, and he's commenting on how applicable is the comparison standards-wise between Europe, which is where Scotland's standards are set or were set, and New Zealand's current standards and future standards.
With Waipa District Council. So I thought that with her background in local government, asset management and project management, she would bring some additional comments to the group. We were asked by, first of all, we had originally engaged by DAA through EY to participate in the RFI, the request for information. So we assisted in assembling some questions which were relevant to the systems, if you like, as opposed to the finances of water and wastewater systems across councils. And so we saw a lot of the data as it came in from September through to February earlier this year. We didn't participate in the modelling per se, either by EY or Wix. Our brief from DIA was to really look at the similarities and differences between the Scottish water environment, and that's the Scotland water environment, not Scottish water per se, but also the 67 councils across New Zealand. So some of so we really were looking at whether the differences made between the two countries would make a significant impact or have a significant relevance to the conclusions that might be drawn. So some of the things we looked at, and it's in our report, we divided it into differences in governance, how when you have one regime, Scottish Water, that looks after all of Scotland, as opposed to the system we have in New Zealand. We looked in differences, the biggest difference in the Tiriti of Waitangi and the impact that might have in terms of regionality, the different groups across New Zealand and how they might see the treaty and governance in that area. Big differences in population density. We are something like New Zealand, 3.5 times as big as Scotland, but we almost have exactly the same population. The way in which our population is dispersed means that in Scotland, something like 95% of the population is connected to water wastewater services. In New Zealand, the number is much, much lower. It's in the order of something like 60%, I think it is, for water, and 68% for wastewater and 80% for water. So whether you connect all of those, the unconnected people to systems is a matter for the future, but it does mean that we have quite a disparate range of services from the point of view of connectivity to systems. We also looked at the difference in standards. It's much more standardised across UK and Scotland, and so that you have national standards to which, or levels of service, for want of a better expression, to which customers can expect their utility provider to serve them. Our systems are much different. The RMA is very much an effects-driven organisation, so it's not as though we have a consistent effluent discharge standard, for example. We are starting to standardise on drinking water standards, and that's something that we'll all have to lift the bar on. Quite a lot of differences in the way in which we have material selection for our systems. Something like 80% of all of the water wastewater assets are buried, are underground. That is pretty consistent across the two countries. The differences in materials, the materials that have been used historically, also the conditions in which those systems are laid. We have a very interesting geological diversity in New Zealand, a very young country, but all subject to heavy seismic events, a large matter of hard rock to peat. Not quite such the same in Scotland. So it does mean that our networks are subject to perhaps shorter design lives, and so some of the assumptions around renewal periods and how quickly that should happen, and how much depreciation and how depreciation is applied to those 80% of assets that we don't see. And then I think there's a certain degree of uncertainty in terms of the sort of environmental standards that we are likely to see come from the need to have a more resilient wastewater system, climate change on a small country like ourselves, and then as we sort of see the changes in resource management roll out, but also the need to meet the New Zealand drinking water standards, the expectations of Te Mata ROI, we are quite I'd say not necessarily immature, but we're quite a long way to go on that step of national consistency of standards, so that everybody can expect, wherever they are, a level of service that's common. I don't know if there's anything else, Lorraine, you'd like to add from the point of view of your experience with
the video cuts there. But again, as Sue said, Don said, and a number of you have said, really the two take-home messages, at least for me, here are that the government's done some modelling. The modelling has got a level of reasonable approach to it, but forecast in the future is not a guaranteed thing, and you couldn't just copy paste those numbers that the government says it's going to be into the future and guarantee it's going to be there. There's going to be differences, but overall, the direction of travel is relatively sensible. So I guess the question here, then, at least the question I was trying to pose to myself was, well, what's the difference? We've sort of explored this a little bit already. Well, how's mpdc doing, relatively speaking? And we're doing well. We're improving. We target things in a sensible way, and we make improvements over time. Like I said, start with our wastewater at our plants at Te Araha and Morrinsville. Think more recently about our drinking water compliance recovery program, and I'm sure we'll respond to things in the future. But maybe the biggest difference, at least in the government's eyes, is timeline. The timeline to do that. And I think, at least for me, my perspective on it is that that's the big factor here, is that you could leave maybe with some regulators, maybe some more financial tools or what have you. You could leave councils to it, but the time it would take for them in the government's eyes to reach the bar that needs to be reached may be longer than the government's willing to sit with. Whereas they feel that through aggregation, amongst all the other, as Jeff said in his video, amongst the entire package, will supercharge that and bring a lot of that change forward sooner. So that's for me, I think, is one of the big factors here, is how quickly can the industry change under any model, whether it's status quo, whether it's the reform as presented, or something in between.
Karl, how quickly do you think it can change? In your opinion, won't hold you to it.
Oh, okay. No, you can hold me to it. I think, regardless, actually, I think this is a 10, 20-year journey. The reason I think that is, one, when we've had opportunities to speak with people at Taswater or Scottish Water, that has largely been the commentary. Hey, we spent the first 10 years sorting ourselves out before we started to be able to focus on the challenges that we were generated to tackle. You can compare that again to Watercare here in a New Zealand context. A lot of time spent just getting everyone on the same page, and even now, not the entirety of the Auckland Super City is on the same page in terms of asset management standards, software approaches, let alone maintenance and the rest. It takes time to make these large scale changes. The other reason I think this is a 10 to 20 year timeline is, regardless of whether you believe the number absolutely, but $185 billion in 30 years is a heck of a lot more money to spend than even we have planned now. And at least in our case, our ability to actually spend that money is relatively limited. And the only way that's going to change is by bringing more people into the industry. Can you pick those people up off the street? No. And at the moment, with the current COVID scenario around the world, you're not bringing them in their truckloads either. So I think it's a 10 to 20 year program of investing and training right back at, in my opinion, right back at the high school level. So you're going to have to grow those people and bring them all the way through from 13 all the way to 23 when they start entering the industry and start actually delivering for you before you're going to see some momentum around the changes. That's what I think. I guess the question, though, back to the timeline is, can mpdc or anybody else do that any faster, any better, any more efficiently under any different model? And that's what you guys obviously have to weigh up, is what's the best way for us to do that for ourselves? Part of the entity, not part of the entity, something in between.
Yeah, and that's a critical point there, because the reality is you can budget to do stuff, but if you haven't got the capacity to do it, what's the difference? So yeah, short term's not going to be much difference from what I can see, but anyway, wait and see.
Yeah, and Don touched on it. It cuts both ways. Don touched on it right at the top of the workshop, which was the ability to deliver the water stuff. It's also in competition with the ability to deliver anything else. So though we're talking exclusively about water now, and maybe I'm straying out of my lane a little bit, I'd encourage you guys to sort of always keep that front of mind, that even though we're talking water, any additional ability that you have as a council to think and deliver in the water space may impact your ability to think and deliver in any other space across council's business portfolio.
Hey, Karl, just touching up on what you just said before too, about going to the schools, and we have talked about this, and I think that from my understanding out there, that the people that have got into the water side of it in council actually really love the job. It is a very diverse and interesting job to get into. Now, we have said it over the years, and I'd love to see us implement this. We've said it years and years ago, that, you know, maybe it's time that council does go to the local high schools and just does a presentation and show them what we actually do, because a lot of the people out there in our communities don't realise the vast scope of jobs that council has, and they're all good jobs. And I reckon there's time we could start getting some apprentices going in the water and waste industry. I reckon it'd be a bonus. I'd love to see us start doing that, and also planning and regulatory side of it. All aspects of the job, I think, need to be promoted, because that's the future.
Yep, and again, the crunch in terms of the reform here, I 100% agree with you, Ash. The crunch in terms of the reform is, though, what is the best vehicle to do that for that issue? Is it to go it alone and get mpdc into every high school in the district and maybe a bit wider, or is it best to go with what the government says, which is roll up into big entities and let the entities do that job, or is it something in between?
The feeling I'm getting out there is that the entity thing is starting to lose flavour around the country. So we'll see how that goes. It plays out in a different field, I guess. But what I'm hearing is now there's about 33 councils that aren't overly keen on the idea. So it's going to be interesting where this ends up.
Yeah. It's definitely a hot topic. So just to round out the reform slides, sorry to move on, is that, you know, in summary, the government sees that the water industry is facing urgent challenges, and I think we can all agree there are definitely challenges in the space. And the government's come to their own conclusion, which is that the only way to meet those challenges is with a comprehensive system-wide reform. And in designing the reform and what it's going to look like, they came up with a series of objectives, which were significantly improving safety and quality, so level of service investment, ensuring all New Zealanders have equitable access, improving coordination of resources, resilience. I mean, you guys can read it for yourselves. Again, I'm not sure that too many of us would disagree or challenge these as being honourable and worthy objectives for any sort of reform. Again, the question comes back to how do you best deliver those? So with that said, we'll just briefly go through how the government is suggesting we address those for us. Again, you've seen these graphs, and you've seen the entity B before. So government says one of the major ways of doing this, on top of adding regulators, changing standards, and the like, is to aggregate council up into, for us, entity B. To control those entities, you need a level of separation between the owners of the assets, as they describe us, which is us local councils, to address some of those iwi Māori, to address some of the negative outcomes that iwi Māori are currently experiencing. You'd like to have them in part of the mix as well. So you've got your council and your mana whenua groups electing a regional representative group, who then appoint a independent selection panel, who then finally start putting together the board, which creates the actual service entity in the orange box there. The government suggested some ways of keeping local voice. I think in their mind, they've appreciated that this dilutes local voice relative to what it is today with councillors. You guys all know that anyone in the community can phone you up at any time and complain or otherwise seek remedy to a waste or water or stormwater issue, and it's a great connection with the service to the community. So they've suggested things like establishing a consumer body, and we'll talk about this at a slide down to track a little bit. Maybe that's something you need to weigh up. What's the benefits or risks in having a consumer body doing the majority of the talking on the customer's behalf into the service entity, relative to what we have today, which is councillors talking into Don, talking into me. On the other side of things, well, they realise that the separation also, or they think they realise the separation also delivers some issues around strategic investment and performance expectations. How do you get multiple councils, 20-odd councils, all happy? Well, you have the representative group establish some strategic and performance expectations. And you guys, as I said, we've gone through this slide once before. This is the mechanism they see it happening. A whole bunch of statements and levels of expectations set by a representative group, customers having their own voice directly into the service entity, and for the balance sheet and control separation that the government thinks is required, then a 3-tiered system to eventually appoint a board for the service entity. But like I said, I've actually got a whole bunch of slides about issues which actually sort of talk directly to those. So this slide here, I tried to stack up, at least from a government's point of view, what parts of the reform actually deliver what objectives in their mind. So that's what this slide is all about. Improving a regulatory framework. We'll see an increase in level of investment and level of service, and improved transparency and accountability. The amalgamation drives the equitable access, the coordination of resources, the resilience stuff, and also provides the financial stability in the government's eyes. And the separation from council balance sheet is necessary to allow more financial stability for the entities themselves, but also in the government's eyes allows the remaining of council to deliver on the wellbeing mandates. So they view it as the separation is necessary to allow councils to focus in a different direction in the future, a direction they would like council to focus in.